So, open your Bibles, please, to Mark chapter 9. We're going to look at verses 30 through 37 this evening. And we're going to change the song title from How Great Thou Art to How Great Art Thou, and put a question mark behind it. But we're not going to be talking about God. Oh, we're going to talk about you and me. Okay. But before we do that, I would like to have a word of prayer. Would you bow with me, please? Father in heaven, thank you so much for this opportunity to study tonight. Thank you for the privilege of being able to study from your word, to learn what I need to do to be a better disciple, to encourage my brothers and sisters and friends, what they need to do to be better disciples. Father, you love us so much, and you're so gracious and kind to us. Thank you. May we, Father, show our gratitude by the way that we live, by the way that we conduct ourselves, how we treat others. May we be a true representative of Jesus wherever we are, whenever we are in those situations. Bless our study tonight, Father, and guide us. Give us wisdom, and may we give ourselves to you. We ask in Jesus' name. Amen. One of the things that's kind of interesting is to be in one of those situations where you're reminded of just how small we really are, you know? I've never been to the Grand Canyon, but they tell me when you stand at the edge of the Grand Canyon, you look out there, you're just small, and you realize how small you really are. Now, I've been in other situations where I've seen that. You know, if you're in an airplane at 35,000 feet, you're looking down on the cities, and the buildings and things, and you realize how small, things really are in comparison to the rest of the universe. It's an incredible thing. And I think it's important for us to have those kinds of situations because we live in a time when, well, I guess people always have, that they're usually too caught up in their bigness, or they see themselves as that. We think we are so intelligent. We think we are so advanced. And we think all these high thoughts of ourselves. And when you go to something like the Grand Canyon or 35,000 feet in the air or something like that, all of a sudden you're brought back to reality, and you get a chance to see this is what we really are in God's presence. And even more so, we're impressed with this is how small we are without God's help. It really takes on a perspective then. So it's good to do that. When you watch the Olympics and you see all of the opening ceremonies, all in different countries that we represented, all different cultures, and wow, that's just incredible. And we're just a small part of a much bigger picture in all things. And sometimes we can feel so insignificant. If you've ever been around when a tornado goes through or a hurricane, and you realize how helpless we are too. Not a thing in the world we can do about that. All we try to do is just survive.
It's the same way at Niagara Falls.
What's that?
It's the same way at Niagara Falls.
Oh yeah, any of those. We went to some falls down in the Falls de Iguazu in the Argentina, Brazil border. Same type of thing like that. It's just, and if you're a believer in God and a follower of His Word, when you're in those situations, it takes your pride and your ego and just puts it away somewhere, because all of a sudden you realize, that without God we're nothing. Psalm 8 in verse 4 says, "What are mere mortals that you should think about them? Human beings that you should care about them." That's the New Living Translation. The translation you're probably familiar with says, "What is man that you are mindful of him?" I like the New Living Translation because it gives all of us, all of humanity in that. It's interesting when you read through the Bible that whenever someone gets a view of the majesty of God, they just they fall down on their face. You know, they are so impressed and overwhelmed by what they are in comparison to God. You know, the smallness that's really there. I think the more we learn to see Jesus Christ, the way those early disciples finally came to see him, you know, that'll do the same thing for us as well. You can picture Jesus, for example, walking on the road to Galilee, you know, but then you see that picture of him in Revelation chapter 1, how he appears to John on the Isle of Patmos. That's a whole different being. In all his glory, he's really something in all of that. That's one of the reasons I like that song so much. I stand amazed in the presence of Jesus the Nazarene and wonder how he could love me, a sinner, condemned, unclean. Mark's gospel does such a great job of showing how great Jesus really is and getting us to really see that for ourselves individually. You know, and what's really sad about that is the quest for the historical Jesus, what he must have really been like. That debate goes on all the time. There was a movie that came out back in the 80s. Never saw it, don't want to see it, wouldn't encourage anybody to ever see it. It was called The Last Temptation of Christ. And the way Christ was portrayed in the write-up about that movie was just absolutely horrible, blasphemous in all of that. It pictures Jesus as being married to Mary Magdalene and having children by her. Then later on, Jesus will commit adultery with one of Lazarus' two sisters. I mean, it's just a horrible thing. And it was based on a novel written by a Greek priest in the 1950s. You know, how somebody could come up with any kind of an image like that about Jesus. Now you have all these, the Gospel of Thomas, the Gospel of Mary, and all these other false writings, you know, trying to find a picture of Jesus. Go to the Bible. Mark writes about a man that he knew about, a man who knew where he was going, why he was going there. That movie portrays Jesus as being just befuddled, you know, and confused about who he is and what he's doing, and not even sure about those things. And as a matter of fact, it says, the writer said that in the movie, he proclaims himself to be divine. You know, tried that for a while. So I want us to look a little bit at Mark's script. It's much better. It's true. And look at what he has to say about Jesus and all of these different settings. And this one tonight, in verses 30 through 37 that we're going to look at, is really quite interesting. We're going to break it down bit by bit. I'm not going to read all of the verses at once like I usually do. I want to just read them a little bit at a time. First of all, let's look at verses 30 through 32. Then they left that place, made their way through Galilee. You know, I didn't check to see how far it was from Rio to Galilee. But, you know, it's a pretty good walk, pretty good stretch of the legs. But he did not want anyone to know it. That is the mountaintop experience they've just left. For he was teaching his disciples and telling them, the Son of Man is going to be betrayed into the hands of men. They will kill him, and after he is killed, he will rise 3 days later. But they did not understand this statement, and they were afraid to ask him. You know, just Jesus talking here doesn't sound like anybody who's confused and unclear about what's going to happen to him. Let's break it down a little bit as we look first of all at this place, because this is where he's taking his first steps now toward the cross. You could argue and say, well, from the time he set foot on the earth, he was taking steps toward the cross. But now it's really in a concentrated way because of the things that have been happening. And Mark mentions Galilee for us, And it's really kind of interesting how significant that is. He had left a place where, north of Galilee, where he had been safe up in Capernaum, and was returning here. And, he's taking his first steps now. It's time to begin the journey. The journey is going to take him to the cross. He's going to go from Galilee now to Jerusalem. And in some ways, that's kind of the summary of the message of the whole book. He started off in Galilee, and now he's going off to Jerusalem. That's where he's been headed all along. But the thing that's interesting about it is not just him as Messiah. It's also a picture of us as disciples, because we're going to follow him. We may start in Galilee. We go to Jerusalem. And there will be a cross that's in our life in all of that. And all the things that are waiting for him when he gets to Jerusalem are really going to be something else. And that's why there's a prediction on Jesus' part that he says, here's where I'm going, and here's what's going to happen on all of that. Notice, if you will, he makes sure when he says that, he's with just the disciples. He's taken the 12 apart with just him. He doesn't want anyone else to know he's teaching. And it's very specific, intensive teaching, not extensive. Extensive teaching was when he was teaching the crowds, the masses, all the people around. This is just for the disciples. It's a very focused kind of teaching. And the language he uses is not one of a doom and gloom martyr, and what's going to take place. It's, this is the way it is. Isaiah 53 verse 10 says, but the Lord desired to crush him, causing him grief. If he renders himself as a guilt offering, he will see his offspring. He will prolong his days, and the good pleasure of the Lord will prosper in his hand. And the good pleasure of the Lord was to crush Jesus at the cross. The prospering of that good pleasure is going to be the resurrection and what comes out of that. But notice the disciples, they're afraid. When you're afraid to ask a question, to straighten out a matter, you got to wonder why you do that. I remember when I went in the military, Jim, they used to tell me the only dumb question is the one you don't ask. And the only time you get in trouble is if you don't ask the question. Ask. But they won't ask you. There's the fear that's there. And you've got to wonder why. What are you afraid of in all of this? Well, maybe he's going to get upset with him. You know how he got upset with Peter here just not long before this when Peter tried to straighten him out. Maybe they decided, we better not say anything else in all of that. But you know what's interesting? He did rebuke Peter. But what Peter was trying to do, and that's a whole different story. Somebody brought it to my attention, and it's true, all that I could find. You never find a place where Jesus rebuked anybody for asking him questions. He always wanted you to ask the questions. And I think that's important for us today. What's on your heart? Ask him. Somebody else may say, well, you don't want to ask God that question. Why? If it's an important matter of life and God can handle it, why would you want to ask God? So anyway, I think the reason they don't ask is they might find out more about what's involved in them if they keep following Jesus. If I don't ask, ignorance is bliss. Not really. You really need to know what's going on. You need to go into this with your eyes open, fellas, and to do that. What they wanted to hear was this Christ is going to set up a kingdom in Jerusalem, and once and for all he's going to make Jerusalem the political powerhouse that it needs to be, that it used to be. Now, they didn't want to hear about the betrayings, the killings, and all this other stuff. And The reason that's important, I think, is because people are still like that today. People prefer an easy discipleship. You know, they don't want that long, hard road. They don't want something that, I really don't want that kind of thing. And I've had people tell me that when I've tried teaching the gospel. We don't want to hear about that kind of Jesus. Yes, sir.
Generally, a lot of people want to travel the path of least resistance.
They want to what?
Travel the path of least resistance.
Oh, yeah. There's a fellow wrote a book about that, years ago. And it's still true. They'd really rather go, and that's why Jesus talked about two roads. There's a wide road, everybody takes that one, it's more comfortable, and they think that's the best one, but they need to look ahead and see where it leads. You need to look on this other road, it's narrower. Not many want that one, but that's the one you really want. Here's what I think. I think Mark's point in these first 3 verses, and he's been doing that throughout the book, but he's really starting to emphasize the idea now in my mind that your view of Jesus as Messiah will directly affect your view of discipleship that God expects of you. The more you understand about Jesus being a Messiah who's a suffering Messiah, what do you expect of the disciples who follow him? We don't like to talk about the idea of suffering. I'd rather have kind of an easy going. And I say that in the sense that most people try to represent that. In their minds, I think Jesus is preoccupied with some morbid thoughts about death, and on the other hand, they're wrongly preoccupied with all these thoughts about, political kingdom and everything else. And Mark's showing us there's still a big gap between what Jesus is trying to get across and the way they're seeing things. There's a big space in between there. And what they need to do is follow him more than just outwardly. They really need to get a closer look at what's going on here. Mark's trying to show us, and remember he's writing to a group of people in Rome, early Christians, and he's looking back on these materials that he's recorded, mostly coming from Peter. And they're getting ready to undergo, and they're probably already undergoing some pressure and persecution, to say, you know what, it goes with the territory. That's part of what it means to be a disciple and to follow Jesus like that. One of the interesting things I keep coming back to and want to emphasize for you guys is that there are 3 predictions, boom, 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 in a row of the passion of Jesus between chapters 8 through 10. He's got one in chapter 8, one in chapter 9, and one in chapter 10. In chapter 8, what we studied there, verses 31 through 33, Jesus began to teach them, it says. He shifted the conversation over to the idea of what was going to happen, taking up the cross and all that other business. And Peter, that's where Peter had rebuked Jesus. And Jesus recognized Peter's actions as being satanic. And he rebuked Peter for that. And in verse 34, he starts off with saying, now he's going to start teaching them about what it really means to be a disciple. Your view of Jesus affects your view of being a disciple. When he gets to chapter 10, if you jump ahead a little bit in verses 32 through 34, that's the 3rd prediction. And it's the same pattern, but you've got a couple of other little details that are added there. And again, he tells them what's going to happen, what they can expect, but they don't understand. They're not getting it yet. You need to understand what it means for him to be Messiah so that you'll understand what it means for you to be a disciple. And then we've got this passage here in Mark 9. So, 3 times in a row, he's trying to teach them. And every time the disciples blow it with their response to how they do that. They need to clear up their thinking of what Jesus is about, but they keep focusing on well, what do I get out of this? What does that mean for me? And Jesus is trying to tell them, but they're not hearing what he wants them to hear. It's a really important emphasis in these chapters, because Jesus is going to talk about discipleship to clear up their view of what they think it means to follow Jesus. And one of the things they need to get across is following him just outwardly isn't enough. I mean, how many people do you know that feel like, well, you know, I was there on Sunday morning, took communion, put a few bucks in the plate, you know, put up with a long sermon, and kind of went from there. Oh, wait, that was me, not Raymond, with the long sermons. You know, did all those things. So, you know, I did my thing. And then they go on with the rest of Monday through Saturday. You're missing the whole point. You know, I can remember funerals, listening to people doing a funeral for somebody, say, well, he or she was just so faithful. They were there every time the door opened. Well, that's not the mark of faithfulness to Jesus. The mark of faithfulness is how your whole life lines up with the will of God through Jesus. So, in fact, it's going to get interesting here that after these three predictions, when we get into chapter 10 later on, Mark's going to show, you know what, this discipleship affects your whole life. It affects every aspect about that. When he gets into chapter 9, for example, in the next few verses, basically it's going to be, you know, what does discipleship have to do with how we handle sin? What does discipleship say about sin? When he gets into chapter 10, what does discipleship have to say about marriage? You know, some marriages are tough. Some are really tough. You know, and some are not working out the way we thought they would. We had all these high expectations and hopes, but we didn't build it as a disciple following the cross, carrying Christ. Or maybe just one did and not the other. What does discipleship mean for your marriage? He's going to ask in chapter 10, what does discipleship mean for your personal wealth? You know, can you make all the money you want to, have all the things you want to, and still be a good disciple? Or just be a disciple? You know, after chapter 10, or after he mentions that other prediction, it's going to get real personal. You know, he's going to quit preaching, and he's going to start getting into your back pocket with you, you know. He's going to quit preaching and go to meddling. And that's the way discipleship should be. When you talk about following Jesus as a disciple, you've got to expect that God's going to meddle in your life to help you, to correct you, to admonish you, maybe even rebuke you on doing that. But if you're following the cross-carrying Christ, you have to ask some hard questions about living, about relationships, you know, about how you can live in this world. And I think one of the reasons people have a view of discipleship that's so messed up is that they want, you know, any view of Jesus except the one that involves a cross. And if you don't get that view of Jesus, you're not going to be following nearly as close as you think you are. You see that bumper sticker? You know, are you following Jesus this close? You know, and of course I know what that means, but it's a good question to ask. Are you following Jesus as closely as you can? And that's what Mark's trying to get us to see. If you really want to be a disciple, you really need to be one who's going to follow just as close as you can, no matter what that's going to take. Well, the second thing I want you to look at here in verses 33 and 34, he's going to talk to them about discipleship and ambition. They came to Capernaum. When he was in the house, he asked them, what were you arguing about on the way? They were silent. Because on the way, they had been arguing with one another about who was the greatest. This is kind of interesting because this is really going to be the main thrust for the rest of this lesson tonight in looking at that. Every time Jesus says something about his death, his disciples follow it up with some kind of a mess up, misunderstanding. There was an old song that came out years ago that Simon and Garfunkel did, and one of the lines in there said, people only hear what they want to hear and disregard the rest. And that's the truth, isn't it? That's the way most people are. They hear what they want to hear, and they disregard the rest. And that's what's going on here with the disciples. Look at the occasion of the argument. It's really interesting. They had been arguing over who's going to be the greatest. You know, as people, we get caught up in power and influence and esteem. I've watched people, when they become preachers, become elders, man, they get power hungry. I've got all this authority. And the only authority you've got is to be a good servant. That's the authority you've got. But that's true of any of us. Who's going to be the greatest they've been arguing? You ever ask yourself what occasioned the argument? Why are they arguing in the first place? What brought all that about? I think it's the transfiguration. You know, go back and think about the picture there a minute. Jesus takes the 12 and goes up the mountain. No, he didn't. He took 3. James, Peter, and John. Leaves the other 9 behind. They go up the mountain with Jesus, have this incredible experience, you know, and they see him transfigured with Moses and Elijah. Jesus is speaking, and all this is just absolutely phenomenal about this. When they come back down from the mountain, the other 9 are there, but they've got these teachers of the law surrounding them, and they're in an argument with them because they're berating the disciples. There was a boy who had a demon, and they couldn't cast him out. Now that's kind of interesting because they had been called a few chapters before and given orders, you know, you can go here, there, you'll be able to cast out demons and do all these other things. And they weren't able, the 9 who stayed down below weren't able to do that. And they're wondering what's going on. You know, and the 3 who came down the mountain with Jesus, and all of a sudden all 12 were back together and they're walking along. I saw a movie years ago that Johnny Cash did, and I liked the movie. It was called The Gospel Road. Now that one, if you ever get a chance to see it, is worth watching. You know, he gets all of his family members and stuff to play different parts, but it's okay. And one of the scenes I've never forgotten was the way the disciples are pictured, for one thing. It was really kind of interesting. The big, tough fisherman, Peter, you know, and John has that way of looking into things. It was kind of interesting, the way he did. But they're on the road, and they're headed from one place to another, like they are here. And Jesus, as the rabbi would do, is walking out in front of them. And they're going on back and forth. There's not a conversation in the movie, you just see them. And Jesus turns around and looks at them, and they kind of like, I guess we better straighten out a little bit and kind of get back in line. And I've always thought, I think that may be kind of what's going on here. The rabbi's walking in front the way he would do. The disciples are walking behind. And they think, maybe Jesus doesn't hear us, so they're talking back and forth. And, you know, you can only speculate what the conversation might have been like, you know. You've got Andrew and Thomas now and all of the others. And, Andrew asked, you know, so what happened to you guys when you were up on the mountain? And Jesus had told them, don't tell anyone. So they're not even going to tell the other 9. Well, you know, Jesus told us we're not supposed to tell anyone, and that includes you guys. Based on what we saw when we came down the mountain, you know, it's going to take a little bit more maturing on your part before we can even tell you. Oh, really? Yeah, well, you know, we're apostles too. I mean, every time you see Andrew's name in the Bible, he's bringing somebody to Jesus. So he's an evangelist. You know, I've evangelized more than any of y'all have. And Matthew said, well, listen, let me tell you, nobody gave up a job like I did, making the kind of money I did, to follow Jesus and be an apostle. You know, all this is going, all this bickering in between them, you know. Well, you know, all I know is if you guys had cast out that demon, it probably wouldn't have turned into the mess it did. Who's the greatest? You know, they're arguing back and forth about all this. The point was, they hadn't been listening to what Jesus had been saying about crucifixion. The important thing is not what we saw on the mountain. The important thing is not the rest of us who were left behind. We couldn't cast out the demon. We're kind of down on ourselves. Now you're not looking too hot on us. The main point of this, did you guys hear what he said about crucifixion? You heard, but did you listen? Or you listened, but did you hear? You know, whichever one you want to use in that. Did you really catch what he was saying about all this? And I can't help but wonder, you know, some of these guys when these Gospels are written, especially when you think about them. Matthew's one thing and John, but Mark and Luke, you know, Luke went back and interviewed a lot of people. Mark did the same thing, but mainly with Peter. Have Peter remember all these stories. Yeah, I remember when we had that discussion among ourselves. You know, it wasn't a pretty thing now we look back on it. Yeah, but you didn't. You know, and we still do that today. Except the way we do it is, I can remember some folks at one church asked me one time, I said, well, where'd you go to school at? Did you go to Abilene? I said, no. I said, oh. Where'd you go to Texas A&M? I said, no. Oh. After that, the conversation kind of shifted, you know. Depends on where you went to school and what you did. One preacher thing they always do is, how big's the church where you preach at? You know, anything under 700 is like, okay. Well, at least the Lord's blessing you. That kind of thing. We still do that sort of stuff today. And we wonder why churches split. We wonder why more people are not being saved. You know, we're not listening to what Jesus said, what needs to be done. So here they are now. They come to this house in Capernaum. I don't know which house it was. Maybe it was Peter's house. Maybe it was the house where he healed Peter's mother-in-law. Maybe it was the house where, you know, they opened up the roof and let the man down so Jesus could heal him. I don't know. I don't know which house it is. The important thing is this. One, he asked them, what was it you were talking about? What was it you were arguing about? See, he knew they'd been arguing. You could tell that. But they were pretty naive to think he didn't know what they were saying, actually. What were you folks arguing about? You know, it's amazing how quick the conversation got silent. I'm not going to tell him. You're going to tell them? I'd rather not do it. It's kind of embarrassing. I had 2 instructors in preaching school one time, and we had a little break room where we had snacks and stuff, Jim, where we could go when we were on our break. 2 of the instructors were in there, and one of the instructors would say, you know, when I go preach a gospel meeting, I want that much. I'll ask for it. And he said, that much, 800. You know, and this is back in the 70s. That's a lot of money. And one of the other fellows said, well, I don't ask for that much. I'll just ask for 5. You know, and do that. And they're going, and we've got a lot of students standing around listening. You know, they're going to go out and be preachers one of these days, Robert. And one of the other instructors walked in. He listened for a minute. He said, somehow I can't see Jesus or Paul talking about, you know, how much did you get when you went to Colossae? And those 2 guys, they left the room real quick. You know, we all have room for growing, but the way we grow is to listen to Jesus, to listen to what's going on. If we were more careful to realize that what we say and what we do is done in the presence of Jesus, I think we'd be a lot more careful about how we I tell people in any relationship, the best thing I can do is I'll treat you the way Jesus would treat you. I'll treat you the way I would treat Jesus if I was treating him. And I'll make sure we both understand we're in the presence of Jesus as we deal with one another. What can't you work out when you do that? What problem will not get worked out? And so here they are. They've been arguing about this stuff, and Jesus now makes them painfully aware that they're in his presence, and they shut up all of a sudden. But watch how Jesus redirects the conversation. He's going to redefine what greatness is. Look at verse 35 through 37. Sitting down, he called the 12 and said to them, "If anyone wants to be first, he must be last and servant of all." He took a child, had him stand among them, and taking him in his arms, he said to them, "Whoever welcomes one little child such as this in my name welcomes me, and whoever welcomes me does not welcome me, but him who sent me." Now, I've got on your outline sheet the body language of a rabbi. Anybody know why Jesus sat down? He's the teacher. That's the way rabbis did it. Go back and read Luke 4. He reads the scripture and then he sat down. He was the visiting rabbi. He's the teacher. They need to listen to him. We've all got our own, preachers have their own body language, right, about how they're going to make a point on doing things. I think Jesus was the best. Very effective, very effective.
It's interesting. You talk about sitting down. I won't get into all that, but it brings you down to where you can see eye to eye.
It does.
And so on some level, when you're talking to someone, and rather than sitting behind a desk and having a conversation, you come out and you sit down, right on the level with them, because you want to get to that level and show them, okay, I'm here with you. I'm not up here, And even Christ did that. You notice, you pointed out he sat down. Much of what he's teaching, he's on their level.
Oh, and really, he's getting below their level to the level people said that he taught on the level of a sixth grader. One of our sixth graders today, I think that's probably like a third grader now. Sixth graders do too much. Anyway, but yeah, I think when he sat down, the disciples said, "Uh-oh, we're going to get it now. He's got something to say to us." Because that usually was the case. He was going to make his point. I know of a preacher one time in a little congregation in Kansas, and he was a young guy, and he had a bunch of older people, especially farmers, hardworking people. And he told them, he said, "Look, when I wear my black suit, it means I'm mad, and I've got something to say to you." He only got to wear that black suit one time, because after he wore it, they fired him. So, you got to be careful about the point you want to make. Jesus knew how to make the point he needed to make. He was kind of a spiritual E.F. Hutton. You remember E.F. Hutton? When he talks, everybody listens. Well, the disciples especially. The second thing to notice is the language of the rabbi. I had never thought about this until studying through this, putting it together. Jesus never rebuked his disciples for wanting to be first. I can't find the passage. If you find it, let me know, and I'll correct everything as far as what I'm saying. I think because God built into our heart a desire to succeed at what we do, to do our best, and to have it come out right, up to a point. After a while, it goes to our head a little bit, I think, and it goes from there. Jesus wants us to do things right as long as you do it God's way. And he wants you to be first as long as you do it God's way. And that's the key here. What is God's way of being first? You know, don't do it the way of the world. In fact, if you look at one of the other Gospels, it says that, you know, it said, not like the people of the world do it. That's not how you do leadership. The way you do it is to be first, you've got to be last. And you've got to be a servant to everyone. The Greek word that's used here for servant is where we get our word deacon from. Everybody is a deacon. You know, somewhere we got the idea in mind when we're talking about church leadership that meant deacons. Deacons are not church leaders. They're church servants. But really, the way elders and preachers lead is by being a servant. Everybody's a servant. Why does everybody want to be a leader? Everybody should want to be a servant. As a matter of fact, in other texts, it'll say, you know, be a slave of all, and he'll use a word that means a bought and paid for slave. Because, oh yeah, that's what we are. We're bought and paid for.
2 times over.
Huh?
2 times over.
2 times over, yes sir. Yes sir. What he's showing them is, here's the radical nature of discipleship. The way of success that I'm showing you, this will totally reorient your thinking. You've been thinking, you know, I want to sit on this throne, you know, when he sets up his kingdom in Jerusalem and do all. That's a wrong view. That's a wrong view. If you're going to follow Jesus, he's going to totally reverse all of your values. Joe Malone used to say when he saw a billboard that a politician was a self-made man, and then he remarked, there's another example of the horrors of insecurity. You know, another reminder of that. We're not self-made men. We're not self-made people in any sense of the word. God has made it possible for us to be everything we are in the world, and when we come into Jesus, it's even more so like that. And one of the things I found too is when you talk about people in the kingdom, as far as the earthly kingdom, the earthly manifestation of the kingdom, we're not all the same. Everybody's different. There are different levels of spiritual maturity. There are different levels of understanding. There are different levels of needs that we have. And that's okay. That just means that if you have more talents and abilities than somebody else does, God expects you to use them to bless those other people. Not to say, well, you know, you come to me because I'm the know-it-all. Nobody's a know-it-all. About the time you think you know all the scriptures you need to know, you find one you don't know. Or 2, or 3, or 150. You know, so that's the way we got to look at it. The earthly kingdom of God is not about power. It's not about position. It's about people and serving them. You know, ironically enough, the earthly kingdom of God is about slavery, being slave. There are something like 3 or 4 different words for slave that are used in the New Testament. And the New Testament will use every one of them to describe a disciple in one sense or another. One of my favorites is in 1 Corinthians 4. And the word that was used there was an under-rower. The old Greek ships and Persian ships, they had 3 levels. And the bottom level, they had slaves who just rowed. They never saw the light of day. They were lucky if they got fed. If you died, they kicked you out, put somebody else in your place and chained him in. You know, and all you did was row. And you stayed in harmony with everybody else you're rowing with. And that's what it was about. And Paul described himself that way, and all of the others who serve Christ. We're just a bunch of under-rowers. But at the same time, we're a bunch of servants. We're here to take care of each other first, and then take care of others. We have that responsibility. That's the way he wants things done on earth as they're done in heaven. Notice his illustration. A child.
Seems like you gotta have a mindset, and you should have a mindset of putting other people's needs before your own.
And that's exactly what he's trying to get across to them. Put other people's needs before your own. It's not about you. It's about what you're called to be, a servant. And he will say of himself in Matthew, the Son of Man didn't come to be served. He came to serve and give his life a ransom for many. So if that's what's true of the Messiah, what's true of the disciple? Same thing. Same thing. Interesting illustration of this child. There's two things about it that well, probably more than that, but a couple things that stand out right off the bat. It says he placed a child among them. He went and got the child. Isn't it interesting that whenever Jesus needed a child, there was always one present? Always one present. I don't think a lot of us like our preacher kids, you know, they're always there when we don't need them. They show up at the most unexpected times. But there was always seemed to be a child there when he needed one. And he took the child and he placed it among them. You know, there's your object lesson, fellas. Look at the kid for a little bit. Now, why is that important? What were children in that day? A nuisance. They were a nuisance. They were to be seen but not heard. In fact, if you don't see them, it's even better. Take the children, send them. Children, women, they didn't have very upstanding roles at all. Jesus revolutionized that whole thing. In fact, Luke, when you read Luke's gospel, he gives more attention to children and women than anybody else in the Bible, because they're important to God. So he takes this child and puts it among them. That's your object lesson, fellas. Look at the kid there. What do you see? What do you see? Well, then he takes the child and puts the child in his arms. That's the next thing. Don't you love that Jesus puts little children in his arms? That's just an awesome picture to me. And you know, when he does that then, I think kids just wanted to be around Jesus. I don't know, there's something about it. That movie, The Last Temptation of Christ, I was telling you about, kids couldn't go see that movie. You know, any movie the kids can't go see about Jesus doesn't need to be seen by adults either. Because any movie about Jesus that kids can't see is fiction. It's a wrong view of Jesus. Look closely at the child. Spend some time with the child, and then you start to grasp what God wants us to know about greatness in the kingdom. Here is greatness personified. Look at this kid. You know, what is it about the children and Jesus? You know, he's not talking about imitating children here. He'll do that in another context. He's talking about how you treat children. That's how you treat one another. You know, interesting thing about children, they don't name drop anything. You know, you can't name drop children. Hey, I know Elias. You know, I know Jason. Big deal. You know, that's what the adults are like. Yes, ma'am.
Yes, I was just thinking about it earlier on. You were talking about the disciples not asking questions. Children aren't afraid to ask.
Now, children aren't afraid to ask questions. They will ask. One too many, but they'll ask them. Yes, sir.
Well, going along with that, children will, if they're hurt, they will tell you. If they're upset, they will tell you. If something bad has happened to them, they will tell you. They don't wear masks. They don't try and hide it. And adults do. We can be going through some devastating things in our life, and we'll walk in these doors, we'll smile, we'll tell you we're fine, and we'll never let you in so that we can bear each other's burdens and so fulfill the law of Christ. No. So we fail in that area. If I can't help you and don't allow you to help me, then we've failed. We have failed in fulfilling the scriptures because we're wearing a mask. Because I'm afraid of what you might think of me, and you're afraid of what I might think of you. So all of us come in here wearing a different mask.
Yeah, we're not talking about the one that CDC was talking about. We're talking about the one you hold in front of your face. We don't see a real face.
Children are not like that. They will, Elias, if he's having a bad day, you know it.
But you know the other thing about children, when you're having a bad day, they want to know what's wrong with you.
They do.
They care. They care.
And if this is a type that Christ is, bringing close to him, that's another thing for us to keep in mind. Those nuisance, those bothersome people, those people out there in the world who are having trouble and having issues and having problems, how are we treating them? Do they feel comfortable enough to walk in here, if they were to walk in here and sit down right next to you?
You know, I think about that fellow that comes in many Wednesday nights and Sunday mornings. I've seen him come in, and I've seen him out in the parking lot there in his vehicle and stuff. I managed to make sure I shook hands with him Sunday, because I didn't get a chance to do that and just say hello. But usually he's so fast, he's going,
You know what he calls, we let him, he stays in our parking lot. He basically lives in our parking lot. And so we talk to him, we talk to the police. This is where he stays. So he leaves. He's going to leave for a little while. And this is interesting. I want you all to hear this. He comes in, he checks in, lets me know this is where I'm going. And he says, I need home to know where I am. And that's how he looks at this place.
Isn't that cool?
This is home.
He lets you know.
Yes. And it's amazing that someone in that type of position, this is what he views as home.
One of the first marks of greatness in the kingdom that Jesus is trying to get across to them is you cannot be a respecter of persons, color, anything else. You cannot. And when people understand that you're that way, they're going to respond the way this fellow does. He knows he can come to us, and he knows how we'll treat him. One thing about children need, and then they need, and then they need some more, and they keep needing. But the good thing about that is they don't mind being around people who have needs and more needs and keep needing. They want to help. And it's just, and I've heard people say, well, we keep talking like that, we're going to fill up the church with a bunch of needy people. Well, may the Lord bless us on that one.
Amen.
May the Lord bless us with that.
Amen.
Because when you're busy taking care of the needs of people, you're starting to learn the way of the cross. What's that song, The Way of the Cross Leads Home? If you're going to take the way of the cross and go home, you have to take care of people. You got to take care of one another. And you can't be afraid to ask, what does this mean for me? It's not what do I get out of it. Maybe in a sense it is, but with the right attitude. What I'm going to get out of it's a cross. Okay. I want to take the way of the cross. That works for me. 2 thoughts on discipleship that we need to understand, and I think it'll make a big difference. By the way, Jesus said, when you welcome a little one in my name, you welcome me. And when you welcome me, you're not welcoming me, you're welcoming him who sent me. Can you think of anything better in your life than welcoming God into your house, into your heart, into your whole lifestyle? You are welcome to enter and take over, because you know what to do with it and what I need. Understanding what true discipleship means, understanding greatness demands understanding what discipleship is, what it really is. It's a radical way of thinking. It doesn't mean power, but it does mean you're given spiritual power. The Spirit who guides you. It does mean that you help the underprivileged, spiritually and otherwise, because you're underprivileged and you've been helped. If you can't see yourself as being needy and helped, there's something wrong. Discipleship's not about authority, it's about slavery. And it's about following the cross. 2 Corinthians 4 and verse 5. Paul said, we do not preach ourselves. We preach that Jesus Christ is Lord, and that we ourselves are your servants for Jesus' sake. That's what we preach. Jesus Christ is Lord. He calls us shots, but we're just here to be your servants for his sake. Not for anything I can get, now somebody said, boy, he's really a great servant. No, it's for Jesus' sake. Somebody needs help. And what's interesting to me is to ask, is it possible for a church to preach that and really be believed today? I believe it is. But what kind of changes does a church have to make to do that? To stand up and say, we at the Rio Rancho Church, we preach Jesus Christ as Lord, and we preach that we are your servants for Christ's sake. To honor his name, we want to be your servants. Would they believe that in this church? Would they believe that in any other church that you attend, wherever you happen to be as you're listening? If you only preach Jesus as Lord, and not preach that we're servants for Jesus' sake, you have an unbalanced gospel. It's not exactly what Paul said to do. We've misunderstood something about discipleship. We preach that he's Lord and we're his disciples and we're here to serve you in any way that we can, according to his will. And secondly, understand discipleship demands seeing who Jesus really is. Boy, the Hollywood movies have made such a mess out of trying to portray who Jesus is. There have been a couple I thought, Passion of the Christ, I like that movie. The Gospel Road, I like that movie. Vicki and I was brought to our attention about this new one, this fellow, I kind of ran him out of Hollywood, didn't he? Because he didn't want to do it their way. It's called The Chosen. We just started watching episode 1 of season 1, and the second season, get ready for that. I hear it's phenomenal. First one's phenomenal. Yeah. So, people who knew Jesus and watching Jesus on me, what else could you want for a role model? And some kind of illustration of how to do that. There are so many misportrayed ideas of Jesus in this world. There's a health and wealth Jesus. That's all he does, take care of your material needs, and you never get around to taking care of spiritual needs in the gospel. You haven't done much. There's the country club image of Jesus, that as long as you kind of dress right, act right, do these things, he's with you. There's a narrow-minded, myopic Jesus, he only goes along according to what traditions we have, and anything other than that, he's just not going to do it at all. There's a social gospel Jesus, just substitute food and clothing for the real food that you need. Bad images. There's the doe-eyed Jesus. A lot of pictures have, he's almost feminine appearing. I want to see the rough carpenter image of Jesus. He didn't go down here, to Lowe's or Home Depot and buy a mower. He wouldn't cut it. He cut it from the wall. He was in shape. That's the kind of Jesus I want to see. Question though is, what does your Jesus look like? If you were going to make a movie, make a picture, something like that, what would your Jesus look like? Anyone that leaves the cross out is useless. I heard about a passion play that's held in Obergargau, Germany. Long word. It's in Germany, someplace. And there was an American businessman and his wife who visited there one time. They saw that and were really moved this thing would be hollow. And the fellow said, if I didn't feel the weight of the cross on my back, I couldn't play the part. Couldn't play the part. Jesus, your cross was heavy. And you and I are asked to carry our cross daily. Sometimes it gets really heavy, doesn't it? Why do we do it? It's not about any earthly power. It's all spiritual. So, you know, if you really want to discover what being a disciple is, you know, you crucify yourself in the baptistry. And then you discover what it means to live as a disciple lives, all the way to Jerusalem and get on the cross. Then you will understand who the Messiah is. That's all I've got for you.
Just a reminder, it's the men's breakfast this Saturday at 9 a.m. We put it off last Saturday because we were working over at a member's house. And so we're going to work there again, I think, this Saturday. We'll do it after the men's breakfast. The men's breakfast is at 9. We'll have breakfast. We'll have devotion together. It usually lasts about an hour, I would say.
Depends on how much we want to eat.
So everybody's encouraged, you know, all men are encouraged to come. If you'd like, guys, two of you want to get together and provide the breakfast this time, let me know. We forgot to discuss that last month when we did the men's breakfast. And so barring that, you will all have to deal with me cooking something, so good luck. It'll be a cereal bar. No, and Pop-Tarts, yes. Yes, at least three.
Well, the question is, okay, fellas, whose wife is willing to help cook something?
Volunteer for you and Robert.
No, David was just two seconds ago. Yeah.
I probably wouldn't.
You want to do it this Saturday? You sure?
Yeah, I'll help.
I'll think about it. Get somebody.
Robert will help me. And Danny will help me, right? We got three of us, we'll do it.
And then also, I got a call from Junior this afternoon. So the camp is going to reopen, and they're going to be working every Thursday, Friday, Saturday in June. And so if anyone would like to go up and help for the day, Thursday, Friday, Saturday, maybe week in June, they'd be more than happy to have people go up. I'm not going to make this, I'll probably go next Saturday. We'll see. And so, but if anybody can go, that would be great. Like I said, it's Thursday, Friday, Saturday. I'll get up there and I'll let you guys know when I go if you guys want to come with me when I decide to go. So that also means that hopefully we'll have our weekend of camp for our congregation. And that's a lot of fun. We have a lot of fun when it's just us and we're up there. Sean cooks these massive meals, him and Janice, for us each night. And we eat great, we have good fellowship. We just have great offers and we send you guys for a really good time. And so I'll give Junior a find on our weekends when we leave. So if you can do that, that would be great. Any help they can get, I know they would appreciate. Be praying for different families who are experiencing different hardships. A lot of the prayer requests in the bulletin. Don't forget the folks who we don't see here. You know, I know I mentioned a few times, but there's families that they're going through stuff, and there's things we don't know about, but they just need to know that we love them, we care about them, we miss them, and we look forward to having them come back. And that's what we can do. Now, absent all that, the church, God will You know, the